Then we kept all the hard questions of philosophy for you now.
That's good. That's the stuff I like. It's going to be the hard questions about cost. I suspect I can guess where they're going to come from, but they're going to be different. Where domain ontologies come from in a much larger context. And I think there are two. Is it okay? Shall I put it on? Yeah, very strong to do this. I'm not very strong. So I hold this? Okay. Okay, so the story I'm going to use is an orality or an evolution story about information, just focusing on information by itself. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is that as disciplines mature, they acquire a history. So for those who are interested in philosophy of science, when Popper talked about science, there was just science, there was no history. And then when Kuhn came along, it suddenly acquired a history. When I was an undergraduate, I was really intrigued. I wanted to look at the intellectual history of the mathematical concepts that I was studying. There was only Bell at the time, Eric, I think it's Eric Bell, and it was stories about, duels and romances and journeys. There was no intellectual history at all. It's different now, so we acquire it. And I think that we
make a cut for a second, because
okay.
When we configure the...
Of course.
We hope so, and it is.
Okay, and I press this to... so where was I? So one of the things that I think is missing from information is there's this silo. There's a group, it's a relatively small group that study orality and literacy. So that's, if you like, information up to pre-computing. Though they do talk about computing a little, but not in any serious sense. They don't have any computer scientists or information scientists. Well, I'm not sure about librarians. I actually haven't seen, maybe there's some librarians who are involved in it. And I think there is if we take this wider context, I'm hoping to persuade you today, if we take this wider context, then we'll get some insight into the role that the domain ontologies is trying to play. And to be honest, if I convince 5% of you, for me, that'll be a success. I'm not expecting all of you to agree with it. And the other thing that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to persuade you, and we had a little bit of a discussion in the previous panel session, that if you can see it in this way, you realize that there need to be new practices, and you can start asking yourself about the practices that you're engaged in at the moment, and you've got something to compare them against. So you've got these historical evolutionary patterns that you can compare them against, and that gives you a template or a framework with which to ask these questions. I think there is, I don't know whether I said it earlier, I think there's a similar exercise you can do with science. You can view science as actually information gathering, and IT is just a part of it. I mean, there are various ways you can slice it up, but maybe that's for next time. Okay, so this is, I'm going to start off trying to just very lightly. So all of the definitions are relatively woolly here. So you're going to be charitable. If you want to take aim, there's lots and lots of things that you can take aim at. And it's a standard sort of, you look back to see these patterns, you try and identify where the patterns are now, and on that basis, you try and make predictions of the future. And then at the end, I'm going to try and summarize. I have masses and masses of slides, so I'm probably, I will go through. I mean, an easy place to start is Gruber, a common vocabulary for a shared domain of discourse. So I'm going to take that as my statement of what a domain ontology is. If you then go and start thinking about it in terms of the enterprise, the agents, typically, well, interesting for a lot of you, I think that you're not, in a lot of cases, you're not always dealing with application systems. You're dealing with textual standards. And I will argue that's a historical feature, and that if you're interested in ontologies, you should be focusing on application systems. But some of you are, some of you aren't. I'm not trying to say you shouldn't look at text and use our information technology to do good things with text. I'm just saying that it's not the topic we're talking about today. one of the things that comes out, I think, repeatedly in my personal experience in the literature, I mean, I'm happy if you tell me later that I'm wrong, if it's okay with you, is that the semantic interoperability is really quite difficult to do. And by semantic interoperability, I don't mean just one API between two systems, but where you can shove these two systems into a data lake and you can run queries over them really easily because they're completely interoperate. That kind of thing seems to be pretty difficult to achieve, if it's ever been achieved anywhere. What happens, and I think it actually happened quite a lot in the military, though it happens elsewhere, when people are faced with this, the management response is, let's have a maturity model. So they build a maturity model, and they identify, in this case, it's a NATO model, degree 3 seamless sharing of data, which is automated data sharing based on a common exchange model. And again, I think this common exchange model is behind this idea of a domain ontology. It's some kind of interlingua. We go back to Gruber for what's going on. I did start looking into what seamless sharing of information was, and I wasn't quite sure. I should ask Andreas. Okay. Can I use this? Oh, it works. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is try and pick out some terms to try and flesh out a really simple structure, and hopefully I've got enough structure there to make a case. So the things I'm picking out here are systems and automated data sharing. I suspect there are... looking around, there are probably one or two people in the room who are old enough to remember the islands of automation. I remember when I started, there were all these rather garish pictures of islands of automation. There's a reference here to Bjork where he has them. What people were trying to show were that, if you like, that over time, you got more and more automation. As you got more and more automation, the islands sort of butted up against one another, and therefore you needed to have these bridges to exchange data. I like Wikipedia because it seems to be relatively unvarnished. Unlike quite a lot of academic papers, they seem to be a bit more cautious about what they're saying. They say the usage is now defunct, and I think this is implying that we're not, in terms of automation, we think that there's a reasonable amount that's been automated. You know, the islands have become continents. But if we then move on to this, and I'm trying to give you like a visual picture for something, and maybe I'm wasting my time because you already accepted, is that interoperability is more like alleyways, yeah? It's not that these continents have expanded out into the space of things that be automated, and most things are automated. You've got these little windows between the systems along which data travels, and it might travel across 2 or 3 of the systems, but if you try and go through the whole chain, as you go further and further down the chain, you get problems. This, I would like to claim, on the basis of a simple picture, and bear with me, I'm happy if you come up and explain to me why I'm wrong at the end. That's a good thing to do, is that the continents are more evolved than the data sharing. So data processing is more evolved than data sharing. We're closer to having some kind of answer to it here. The other thing that, just to point out, which will come in later, is that data sharing arrives as a requirement. There's some requirements are okay. Arrives as a requirement once you've got successful data processing. If you have no data processing at all, then there's no system to share between it. So there's a dependency between the two. And also the other thing that I will want to, again, I'm not going to make a strong argument, but I'm going to make a claim, is that in a sense that domain ontologies are expecting them to play the role of expanding the alleyways, so that the bridges should be as wide as the continents, so things can be shared. And you can see these things where people, I think this, I can't remember, I don't keep up with the data lake community, but I think they've got data fabrics and there's something else. But anyway, someone comes along every 6 to 9 months with a new way of explaining how things can be semantic interoperable, so they can get new funding. Yes. Again, Wiki, I know you're not meant to do this, but this was suitably plaintive. I mean, they talk about hand tuning and all of the problems that are there, and that's certainly my experience. Again, if your experience is different, share it at the end. But it's not easy to get these domain ontologies to work in an industrial context. If you take domain ontologies to be, and I think that isn't necessarily what's being referred to here. The common model that will underpin the seamless exchange of information between a series of different systems. So that's quite a big requirement. Okay. So just, this is some stage setting here, and I'm calling it, I'm trying to give you a story, the long story about the whole history of information. Shall I say something? Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
yes, it's back.
Okay, thanks. So this is mapping the evolutionary stages onto the classifications, and really what I'm trying to get to here is this. I don't want to recurse my fingers, but is these arrows here. I'm trying to say, look, there are these big changes. So the shift from pre-oral to oral was when you had one brain to another brain. There was some way of communicating, and this is, I'm thinking, okay. And this is probably a good example of how actually do you do it. And I'm assuming it's some kind of language, because you probably have some, and also the language doesn't have to be speech necessarily, it could be sign language, but it would be some kind of language, because presumably there were sounds beforehand. So you could have all sorts of stories about when it happened, but that was a long time ago. In fact, I think there's a recent article that shifted it from 7 million years ago to 27 million years ago. But anyway, it's just so far back that we probably don't need to worry about. And then the things that happened here with literate is you get the storage of information outside, and you also get this communication which goes from brain to external. That's not meant to be the order, so there's we'll come back later to the order. So it could be, it's just the nodes. So there were these disruptions, and certainly with the introduction of writing, when they first talk about it, which was depending on the different, it's the 9th century BC, when did it take over and everything else. There's a nice series of literature that marks the difference between Plato and Aristotle, between the supporters of the oral ways of doing things and the supportive ways of writing, and they're nice quotes if you look through both in Plato and Aristotle on this. I'm not trying to remember what my next slide is. Is there something happening? I don't seem to be, should I, it says a retroportage, just something. Maybe I shouldn't be allowed near this.
No.
Is that okay?
I forgot to move back. It's my fault.
Okay. Okay, so then the next question that comes up is quite interesting. Is that for me? I published a book in '96. Well, I worked on a legacy modernization system, and for various reasons, I ended up using ontology in the late '80s and the early '90s. And then I was trying to explain what was going on, and one of the things I came across was, among other things, was World on Paper, this various other books, and I suddenly realized that, for me at least, this history of information explained a lot of what was going on my projects. And one of the things that Olson talks about here, I mean, that's part of his thesis, is that you can think of literacy in a very narrow sense as being able to read and write. And in fact, a number of in his area, he's involved in psychology, child psychology, but also, if you like, in general literacy, is that if you train someone to read and write, you've got literacy. And in fact, when they start looking at it, when they do it in either in developed world countries, like he's from Canada, or even in Africa or Latin America, it doesn't quite work like that. And so what he's saying is that what you, and he actually says, and I'll come on to a second, is that if you actually look at the history of literacy, what happens is it's a communal cultural practice, and it involves collating and creating common access to historical textual information, as well as creating new text and information. So it's a text lake, if you like, if you want to think like a data lake. It's making the text accessible to everyone. Now, I think because one of the things for me at least is that I think if you're not an historian, sometimes the past is a surprise. Let me see here. Okay, so the standard thing that you'd assume that if people had quill pens and they could write, that they would use writing. But by the way, if you're interested in this, Carruthers is the Book of Memory is a really good book. But everyone uses the example now. They have when Aquinas was canonized, they took a lot of statements and included the statements about how he worked. And apparently, he would dictate to 3 or 4 scribes. So he wouldn't write; there'd be someone else to write, and he'd be dictating 3 or 4 books at the same time. One sentence to that scribe because they write slowly. Another one to this one. This one. I have a colleague who actually reads Aquinas who said, "Oh, that explains why he reads so badly." But that's maybe slightly unfair. If you see the statement here, I think that is from Carruthers as well. Composing the text prior to printing was not writing at all, but composing mentally and performing orally. And I think there is something else. And I'm luckily there's a barrier between you and me here. I think a lot of you guys here are doing stuff that's not yet computerate. If you think about the way you're working with text, you might be using computers, but in a sense, my argument is you're in the same state as Thomas Aquinas. I mean, Thomas Aquinas is not a bad role model, but you're, in a sense, from a technology point of view, you haven't acquired the techniques or the practices needed to run computing in the way that it needs to be run, or the way that it can be run. Okay, I should be clear. So again, I'm just trying to extend my framework, and I'm putting this up partly to give me a way out. This is a very, very rough structure. There are 101 reasons why you could look at the gaps. But I think it gives you, as a simplification, it gives you a certain amount of truth. So the thing that we're looking at here is the brain to external, external to brain. And again, we map this out and we're just saying, look, there was a shift here. So when you put the directions in, so brain to external is doing the printing, but external to brain is reading. So how, it seems like I'm on a sticky wicket here. I've got to argue that just because the book's printed, you read it in a different way. I mean, I don't know whether I should do this. If I was, do you think I'm going to be able to justify that claim? I mean, does it sound like a likely claim? Does anyone put their hands up? Well, maybe I shouldn't ask people, but okay. Certainly, when I was getting into this stuff, it was not something that I thought about at all. So if you take this definition of literacy as the cultural practices, and you start looking at the cultural practices, let me see if I can, okay. There's a lot of the historians who study the astronomers, including Tycho Brahe. One of the things that they noticed is that it was kids, a little bit like, I suppose, computing nowadays. These kids started doing stuff that was really advanced compared with their teachers and so forth. So this Tycho Brahe was using his planetary tables, and he had 2 tables, Alphonsine and Copernican tables, checked them and found them it was wrong. Now there was one thing that was different is that he was able to have 2 tables because of the costs of printing and so forth, was able to do printing, but he was using them in a different way. There were different practices that people were now able to do as a result of these things being there. Right. there was something else going on, and I think that Francis Bacon is quite important in this in articulating, if you like, a manifesto for how it should work. Is this Bacon there? I'm trying to think. Yes. He says, yes, there's a quote there. In the past, invention was done by allegorical thinking rather than by writing. And he's got this notion that now when I write something's down or I print it, I'm trying to write a more accurate picture of the world. And you have Hook and Boyle doing the same sort of thing. They want to when they're writing things up, they want to write things exactly as they are. And they think people in the past weren't doing that before they started doing this. And can I move this thing down? Is this?
Yes, on the schema.
Am I allowed to?
You can drag it out elsewhere.
Okay, cool. That's good. Okay, and the sort of claims that are made is that as a result of this, you got a major change in the way information was managed from, I think Olson's probably being unkind, calling them pseudosciences and general sciences. We go astrology to astronomy, alchemy to chemistry, and so forth. There was a change in the way in which knowledge was managed. I think I might have. No, that's okay. One of the things that I was surprised at is the way things work differently. So there's, I think, where are we? Yeah, there are two examples here. So, and it was particularly interesting, particularly true of maps, that we probably don't have time to talk about it, but people didn't make copies of maps, and there was two reasons. Whenever you made the copy was never exact, because it's really difficult to copy the maps exactly. Even text was difficult to copy. And the other thing is, every time you turned the page, you wore the book out, and it cost an enormous amount to produce the book. So people would lock this stuff away. I mean, you imagine people write these books and they read them. That wasn't the case. There would occasionally people would read them and memorize them and stuff like that, and the ways of handling memory. And for astronomy, it was particularly obvious. So they had, I think they had readings going back to thousands of years that they could look at, Copernicus and the other people could look at. But because they've been transcribed so often, there was lots of errors. And also, if you know you're going to write something down and some idiot's going to transcribe it incorrectly, you're not exactly motivated to take a lot of care. Why would you? So where are we? So what happened when printing came along, for various economic, among other reasons, is that you could produce lots of copies at scale, so there's more stuff around it, and you could check it, and there were practices for checking, and there were all sorts of practices, like the printing presses used to compete with one another. So they found something was wrong, they were motivated to change it. There were a whole lot of motivations, feedbacks in the practice to try and, if you like, improve the way things were stored. And as a result, you've got different classifications. I don't think I talk about it here, but the Linnaean classification and so forth. In fact, I think we were talking about in chemistry, you have a similar classification systems. All of those evolved after a couple of hundred years as a result of printing being there. And what I want to argue is that domain ontologies are, in a sense, this same phenomena, but repeated at the next level of technology. Okay, so I'm going to make a distinction between data processing and data sharing, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to give my definition just for the sake of this presentation about data processing, and we can come back and take it. It's just for the sake of this presentation. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it as the right kind of terminology. I think we made the distinction earlier between processing and sharing when we talk about continents in many ways. Just to try and get a distinction between text and data, is that data is structured in a way that allows it to be processed. I don't want to commit to the fact it's got to be a particular RDF or something else. And it's structured, the particular thing we're interested in, when it's structured for processing by a computer. I think you could argue that log tables, which were printed, I don't know, in 18th century and stuff, you could argue a data in some kind of sense. You could even argue that the original Linnaeus classifications were some way data. So this is structured for processing by a computer. And the litmus test is just to try and process it with a computer. If it works really well, it's structured okay. I mean, you could argue that our computers are going to become so clever in 100 years' time that they can read text and so forth, but just where we are at the moment. So semi-structured forms of tables are sort of dodgy, and if you've tried to create an ontology out of them, you realize some are really good and some are bad. Excel, for instance, would automatically be a limit case, particularly if it's got lots of merged cells. And structured database tables or objects would be more obviously data, but I think just being structured isn't enough. One other thing to note, I'm trying to now motivate this distinction between data and text, is that one of the things that happened, and this was a surprise to me, all the original writing was pictures of things. So they'd have a bowl for food, or it wasn't, well, they weren't pictures for words, they weren't names for sounds. You can see this thing here for the Egyptian Mesopotamian scripts, which was the early writing. Getting down to language took half a millennium, 500 years. Yeah? And Rousseau is a little bit more rude about it. He says depicting objects is appropriate for savage people. So this is him showing disrespect to our current data modelers. So what you find if you look at most texts, they're representing language. I was going to say it's spoken, but they're written, doing something that can be spoken. The characters are, roughly speaking, signs for sounds, and the words are signs for a concatenation of sounds. Data is, even though we have these textual things and so we can read them, but the box in a computer data model, or the row in a data table, or the table itself, or the cell, is meant to refer to a thing. It's a thingology rather than a wordology. And it's interesting if you look at it if you've put your evolutionary hat on it, there's a name for it, pedomorphosis, is where you get a change, where you get evolution, where you return to your juvenile character. And apparently that's what happened to us quite a few times in our evolution. Again, this is just a repeat of literacy, just changing computeracy instead of literacy, and data instead of text. So the idea is that you've arrived at a computer culture if it is the case that your data resources can be, your historical data sources as well as your new data sources can be collated and shareable. And I don't think that's true now. Hopefully no one disagrees. So that's the thing, that's, if you like, the goal that we want to aim for. And that's why we have, when we do the mapping, that's why we have the question marks here. And again, this is full of holes, I admit it, but it's just trying to give you a feeling for what's going on. So the key thing about data processing, I say, is characterized by algorithmic specification of the rules, and the rules specify the shape of the data as well as the processes. And it's for carrying out a transformational process. And we can dig down on that, and that will be being interesting. But the algorithmic specification of rules is actually a formalization. So application systems are formalized. So in terms of you talking about having something that's formalized, if you've got an application system that's working, it's formalized. So the formalization is done. And also you could think of this formalization as another marker of the differentiation between data and text. Sharing is where you take the formalized data from one system and you share it with another system, and the other system understands the formalization, because that's all you've got in the computer system. You haven't got anything else. It's just got a formal structure. And what it does is it means that if you want a domain ontology, is sort of in my world, where you're trying to share between application systems that have got this formalization, your domain ontology has to have at least as much formalization as the system you're sharing data with. Otherwise, you can't pass the data on. So if you're sharing your transformation from the original the source system into the interlingua before you get to the target system, drop some of the formalization, you're losing information, and you haven't you're not meeting the if you like, the goal that you're aiming for. I mean, admittedly, that if you did it and you lost a little and got it worked, it would be pretty amazing, because it would be pretty successful. But it's that's what you're aiming for in the end is to have the sharing. So the thing that I'm saying that, okay, so we know we have this very grand aspiration, and I think a lot of people, when they talk about ontologies, that's hidden in some of the discussion. There's some equivocation going on. They're talking about this aspiration where they share all this stuff, maybe do reasoning over it, and then when they go and they only do a little bit. So just what I want to be clear, absolutely clear about is if you like, this is the goal and how do we get there? This is the requirement and how do we get there? Okay. So just two simple sort of structural things, just trying to, they're not, well, the second one may be a bit cleverer, but the first one is not aiming to be clever, but it's just trying to say, look, this is, in terms of the structure, this is the stuff that comes out. Okay, so I think you've got this notion of point to point and hub and spoke. If you go to the literature, they talk about the different ways of doing things. There's a quote there of point to point about you take a source schema and you map to a target schema in some way. And you can see that at a very simplistic level, that there's no space in that kind of way of doing things for an interlink, but you don't need it. If you're going to try and transform stuff, you have some kind of mediation here, is that you're going to have, I've done one, I mean, there are places where you do 5 or 6 for different use cases and so forth. But I'm just trying to keep it simple. And I think there's an argument, and that they often use in the mediation argument, that says that if you've got to go point to point between all of the systems because of the binomial expansion, you get your point to point soon gets pretty high, and you have to have a lot of interfaces. So there's certain economies for going this way. So as well as, if you like, this, you could see this as an argument for trying to go down the domain ontology route, trying to keep things simple. Okay, so this is something that's a little bit more difficult and maybe a bit more contentious. So I've used the terms empiricist and rationalist. They're used in modern philosophy for positions in epistemology. I'm actually more using them, though these terms in modern terms do come back from their historical roots. I'm doing it more for the historical roots, where you have the continental rationalist versus the British empiricist. And the idea, the rationalists were the idea that you could sit down and you could just work out the way things were through reason. The empiricists were really obsessed with data. I mean, we talked about Francis Bacon earlier. I mean, Locke was one of the early empiricists, and I remember being at a conference where a friend of my mother's was there, and he was talking about going to Locke's library and seeing, or he cut out all these little pieces of paper and he'd written down what he'd seen because he wanted to be absolutely sure that he got what he'd seen in terms of, so he's really keen on it. In terms of, coming back to computers, in terms of the empiricist, this is something that I think I mentioned in the previous panel, is that you start with the data. So a rationalist would start with experts. I would claim these experts probably are living in a pre-computing age in terms of their cultural practices. I would actually, I've got papers on it, I would argue they probably don't have a model in the mind of what they're talking about. So when you're interrogating them, you need to be really careful. I'm not saying they don't have expertise, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a model in the mind. Wittgenstein shared my view, so at least I've got someone on my side. With the empiricist, you very much start with the data. That's not to say you don't have the SMEs around to help sometimes, or various people to help while there's a little head there. And I think that if you look at it as well, if you go back to the two architectures, if you think of the point to point, when you start with the source scheme and the target scheme, so you're starting with the data. So you've got some ways of starting with the data. However, when you start coming to hub and spoke, there seems to be this tendency of wanting to start the model from scratch, start with a blank sheet of paper. And I can see it if you're running the project, because you've done your bit of the project, you've done your model, really low initial cost. You don't know whether it works or not, but that's someone else's problem. That's not your problem. So there's a kind of attractiveness for this. I'm trying to articulate, if you like, at least from my perspective, the difference that goes on in the rationalist and empiricist light. And the issue here is that you're essentially producing your domain ontology, and then you're checking whether it maps to all these application systems, schemas, and then you check whether it matches to the data. What a lot of people do is this empiricist light, is they'll start with the schemas. And if you've worked with any reasonable amount of data, I'm sure most of you have done this, the data doesn't match the schema. I mean, so you've then got to do the second matching where you've got to check with how the data is going to map in, and you've got to alter the mappings to handle the data. If you start from the data right from the get-go, you know that you've got your mapping right. I mean, the data and the schema. So in a sense, you're going straight to the source because the data is as you said earlier, the data and the data processing system is a formalization. You know, it's formalized, it's just not semantically transparent. So what you try to do, all you're trying to do is add semantic transparency here. I think there's some feeling, and you can tell it when you talk about SMEs, and I sometimes think it's, having worked in IT, is that SMEs are marvelous because you can get them to tell you what's going on, and if it goes wrong, it's their fault because they gave you the wrong information. And I think you're setting these people up to fail. It's really unfair. And the other thing to note that's really commonplace, you can see this in the literature, and I've had it in my personal experience, is that people are optimistic, so they build their domain ontology in a rationalist format, and then they start looking at the schema, and they've got very little budget left, so they quickly fudge it to get it work. And then they do the volume testing, and it really doesn't work. So they try and get just some way to work, because they've got no budget left. So what you end up with is a structure that isn't, it's really not of a sufficiently high quality. And the goal, I think, of what you're trying to do, if we go back to this story about what happened with printing and the introduction of science, is you're really trying to get something high quality. And what this does is maybe makes you a little bit more honest about how you spend to get to your high quality. I think I've done a little bit of the argument here. I'm claiming that the choice between the empiricist and the rationalist boils down to the way in which you manage formalization. There's a complication here, which I'll come to in a second, but if you're an empiricist, you say, I've got these data processing systems, the stuff's formalized, or even if they're unstructured, they've got some kind of ontology, I'm going to run with that, because if that's successful, I mean, if you get a system that's never been used or data that's never been, then I suppose it's untrustworthy, you shouldn't touch it. But let's assume it's been used for 20 or 30 years. You know that it must work in some ways. What you've got to do is salvage the formalization for that and reuse it. And in a funny way is that you're actually forced to do the salvaging here as well, because if you build your new system, your marvelous new system that's really pretty, that your subject matter expert has told you is right, so now you can blame them when it's wrong, and you've got to then go back 5 minutes. Okay, yeah, I think I'm close to the end. That's unusual. Thank you. Okay, I'm suggesting that if you buy my story about formalization, what's happening here, if you take this rationalist approach, is you're actually incurring massive extra cost and the likelihood of lower quality, because you don't budget right for what happens when it's a shock when you see how much variability there is in the data when you try and capture it. Okay, so the story I'm trying to give you now, in a way, is the same story that happened with writing and printing. There's Aristotle and Bacon. They both sort of claim that the previous way of doing things was really inaccurate. So that's what I'm saying, the same thing. So if you like, we're getting a repeat of the pattern. We're moving to a stage where we've got to have sort of some kind of finer granularity, or even just a different way of doing things. So when we look back at the previous way of doing things, it doesn't seem right. And I think Kuhn has got this thing when he talks about scientific revolutions. He says, it is like this duck rabbit where you get a shift, a gestalt shift in sense. But the difference is that when you see the new way, you can't shift back to the old way because it looks so stupid. So someone who's worked out Newtonian physics can't go back and look at Aristotelian. It looks weird. Okay. So I'm claiming, and again, I welcome feedback, that this idea of an empiricist approach is a relatively new practice. It certainly is a new practice compared with pre-computing, but it is pretty new, even with computing, because most people work with. I said 5 minutes without questions.
Yeah.
Okay, I better zoom one. Okay, so basically, I was trying to say, you might then say, this is a really nice idea, Chris. You're an academic. This is a brilliant academic idea. When someone knows something about it, and these next few slides are just trying to say, this is what we've been doing for the last 30 years. This process here. This is the kind of things that we do. You get a lot of different systems, and you triangulate across them. You do your ontology, then you split it out into various different things, and you research. And the key thing here is that this is the litmus test. When it goes into the new system, if it works, you've done your job well, and it won't work the first time. So you go around the cycle a few times. I wanted to talk about one particular practice that naturally arises from the way we did it, and we then found afterwards the name for it, shift left testing. because you've got all of your data right at the beginning when you're doing the conceptual model, you can do all the conceptual testing. You don't do the implementation testing if you're doing an application development or whatever. But what happens is you've got something that these people aspire to in terms of shift left. I think the shift left they were doing empiricists in light because they were testing on the schemas, not on the data. But in all cases, you run the whole data. And what it means is that after you've run the whole data and tested it right at the front, you've got your reliability, you're sure it works. Oh yeah, and of course, if you go back, again, it's normally the astronomers that they all talk about. They check things, they made sure everything works. So it's the same sort of idea going on. Okay, I think, so shall I stop now and then we do questions? Yeah, so this is just, I'm just repeating what I, so perfect, thank you. Thank you. So we have time for 2 questions. And for sure, ladies first.
Hello.
Hi.
On your slide number 36.
Press for people to do this.
36, yeah. I didn't really catch why you say that the rationalist is higher.
So we did, this means that the rationalist is more lightweight and empiricist is more heavy. And the reason is because the rationalist costs more. If you're making the judgment, the idea of it's heavier is better. We debated, I don't think there is a normal way of looking at it. But when we did it, we decided that if you're lower down, it's better. And the claim is here, it's down here, is that because you're doing the formalization twice, you've already got the formalization, the data processing. And then when you build this model from scratch, you're doing another formalization. You don't know whether it matches up with the data in the data schema. Maybe you've done, I'm being mean here, maybe you've done all your use cases and your requirements, you feel really confident. But even then, you grant me that when you put the data against, there'll be 1 or 2 things you missed, yes? Or you give it me, or?
Well, it depends.
Okay.
If
You
you
have the
have
floor.
an overarching architecture
Yes,
and your use cases and requirements are slices into that architecture,
yes.
then you don't miss as much.
Oh, no, okay, yes, no, okay. I'm not fighting you on that, but you don't get everything, yes? The data gives you more. That's the point I was trying to make, yeah?
Sometimes, not always.
Okay, I'm being serious now. I'll be interested in cases where it doesn't, yes? Because I mean, in our experience, when you look, particularly we look at the data really, really closely to try and identify all of the underlying things. And it's a constant surprise, if you like, what we unearth. So have I answered your question? Probably no, yes, no? Yeah, that's cool.
Last question. Okay, Emilio.
One, the driver is waiting.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I mean, can you maybe say some words concerning the advantages and disadvantages of the approaches that you just discussed? I mean, if you're an empiricist, then what does it mean in terms of advantages and disadvantages against being a rationalist?
Okay, so I have a story about, okay, I won't mention any names. We thought we could build ontologies. We thought we were really clever because our ontology is the best, as everyone here knows, you all know, is the best ontology in the world. We've been doing ontology for decades. We know how to do ontology. So we had a really small system. It wasn't big at all. It was like a, I don't know, 3-4 week development. And we said, look, we've got to do it the right way. We've got to eat our own dog food. We'll build the ontology. Yeah. So he designed the ontology and we gave it to someone to code. And he's a hacker. Some of you know him, but he was saying, why am I doing this? I could do this in 3 or 4 days. Why are you giving me this? You've got to do it properly. We couldn't get it to work. Then we said, okay, hack it in, get it to work. And then we looked at it, we said, this is an unbelievable mess, but it worked. And then we cleaned it up. So I think what we're saying in a sense, and probably I didn't do it in the right way here, is that I think the process of building an ontology starts with the formalization and trying to get it to work in an application. And then what the role of the ontologist, and in the sense that your presentation, when you put those 3 senses, was a kind of version of that. We're trying to look at what's there and make it cleaner. I think it's not a good tool to go in and assume. And I think the reason is, and maybe it just as is a temporary phase, is that most of your experts and most of us have grown up in a world of paper, a world of text. I mean, okay, I've been coding for I don't know how many years or whatever, decades, yes, but I still think I'm rooted in this text. And all our practices, if we go back to the story, are rooted in text. So I think the only way that we can get ourselves to be data focused is by being really close. Am I answering your question? Yeah. And I think there's something else, and there's the other thing that I think happens for me is and this comes back to the other story of way of doing this, situating this in the history and philosophy of science, is that it's actually a way, if you go in the data and you've got your process of formalization right, you get a series of mini revolutions. In other words, you get a series of mini paradigm shifts. I think we've got a paper on accounting and a paper on nomenclature that sort of explain what's going on. And what's interesting about both of those, particularly the later papers on accounting, is they actually link back to standard problems in philosophy. So what's intriguing is that I don't think that philosophy is always right and that if you study philosophy, then you know the answer. I think that's not true. But I think that when you come against this problem, if you've got this toolbox that all these philosophers have been working on, you can pick out a tool to fix problems in interesting ways. And if you go back to what happened in early Renaissance science, you can see they were doing these mini revolutions all the way down the line as they got more information. So I think that it's the same. There are 101 other ways as you drill down deeper with their parallels. But I think that's the thing, when I was talking to you earlier about doing something different, I think there is a series of different exercises, and maybe as we discussed, yours is a small step towards it. I'm hoping to do big steps in a small area. You see what I mean? Yeah?
Perfect. Thank you again, Chris. Perfect. So, quick reminder, so we have the gala dinner and the visit of Lourdes. So the bus will pick up now, drop at Rex and next hotel. I will wait for 20 minutes and then pick up again for Lourdes. So the bus will leave the next hotel at 6:15. Okay, and then from Foch at 6:25. So be there on time, please. So if you have cars, you can go, but be sure that do not drink this night. So you have options. And then tomorrow morning, so the pickup of the bus is 8:30. Yeah, 8:30. Perfect. So also a restaurant if you drive. So the restaurant is the Grand Hotel Gallia at Lourdes. Another thing, if I don't know, if you have your wife, your husband, your friend with you, so they are welcome. Everybody is welcome, and this is thanks to Rebecca from Airbus.
Now you have to.
Yeah, bear with me.
I can't think what I